Well, good afternoon. As stated, I'm Bill Fujioka, the chair of our Board of Trustees for JANM, and we're extremely proud of our facility. And you're sitting in our Democracy Center right now. And people think that JANM is just a museum, but this element right here, we call it the democracy, but it's also called the preservation democracy. We have events like this, we have book events, we have other events where we bring speakers that will present information on the importance of social justice, the importance of preserving democracy, and the importance of equity and inclusion. I want to welcome Gregg Jones today, the author of this book. And we also have his Ben's daughter, Julie Kuroki, and then the granddaughter, Miki-san. I don't know, what's the granddaughter? Oh, grandniece. That's still pretty close, too. And our moderator, Susan Kamai. This book, like a lot of things we have at JANM, preserving the history, preserving the stories of our families. I consider Ben part of the larger Japanese American community family. It's so important because what they went through during World War II is something that needs to be not only preserved but retold to the future generations. Like, it's important for my son and his someday he'll give me a grandkid. I keep bugging him about doing that. But the importance of preserving that history and what they went through and the heroism and the racism they had to deal with is critical. And so today, JANM is happy to host Gregg and the moderator, Susan Kamai, who's done so much. You have no idea her history and her presence in the JA community, in the greater AAPI community. So thank you very much. Enjoy this presentation. We had an annual board meeting this week. I was here yesterday from 11 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and this morning. So I'm a little bit tired right now. And so I'm going to get in my car and go home and get out of this coat, because look, all of you are dressed comfortably. I have a sports coat on. And so it's very hot. So thank you very much. Again, welcome to JANM. Enjoy the event. Take care.
Thank you, Bill. We could not do what we do here at the museum without people like Bill on our team. He leads this museum through all of the work that we do, and we're really grateful. And he wrote the intro for this book today, so you can continue to read his words. Also, hello, my name is Joy Yamaguchi. I'm the Director of Public Programs here. I'm also here to help guide us through the program today, along with Elizabeth. But yeah, so thank you so much to Bill for being here and to our guests. And back up on the mic just to welcome our guests up. So once again, we have author Gregg Jones and Professor Susan Kamei. And so I think they don't need further introduction. I know we have lots of family and friends in the house, so I'm going to pass the mic right over to Gregg and Susan. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth and Bill and Joy. And welcome to all of you who are here in the Tatuchi Democracy Center and to our virtual audience. It's nice and cool in here. It's blistering hot outside. And I'm very excited to get to be part of this conversation with Gregg. And this is your first visit to Little Tokyo and to JANM. So
yes.
So I was here in this very spot a couple of months ago for the Little Tokyo short story contest for this year. And an amazing number of the stories involve ghosts and spirits. And so this is Obon season, and so I think our community spirits are joining and welcoming you to the community here.
Thanks very much, and thank you for doing this, Susan. I'm thrilled to have you sharing the microphone with me here. So thanks.
Oh, it's been very fun to prepare, and we're in for a treat of a journey and in what the background for both your process with the book and also the story of Ben. You've had a celebrated career as an investigative journalist. This is your fourth book, so you're a seasoned hand at bringing important stories to life, contemporary and historical. and the process of bringing a book to the bookshelf. Tell us a little bit about how you came to the story of Ben and what motivated you to put it into a book.
Right. Thanks very much for that. And like so many stories, Bill touched on this as well, that the stories are rooted in our families, stories that are rooted in our past. And for me, Ben's story started that way as well. And this photograph right here, I grew up on the edge of the Missouri Ozarks. My mother was the youngest of 6 children from a farming family, northeast Arkansas and southeast Missouri. And one of the stories that I grew up with was the loss of my uncle in World War II. And this image here was one of the artifacts of, in my childhood, of a box of photographs and other things. And my uncle had been an Army Air Forces radio operator. I'd been a poor kid on the edge of the Cotton Belt. Family lost the farm and sort of had an itinerant lifestyle. But then after Pearl Harbor, February 1942, entered the Army Air Forces, deployed to England in 1943, and then in the fall of 1943 went missing during a raid over Austria. The B-24 outfit that he was in happened to be the same B-24 outfit that Ben Kuroki was in, and they overlapped for several months in the summer and fall of 1943. I didn't know who Ben Kuroki was, but my grandmother had a book that was published in 1962 on a famous raid that that Ben flew and my uncle flew, the low-level raid on the Romanian oil fields that were the most important source of oil for Hitler's war machine. So 2 months after that, my uncle had disappeared. This book had a wonderful 64-page photo insert, and 25 pages into that photo insert was this photograph right here. And this was the first time that I laid eyes on Ben, was looking at that book, and then the photo caption, which described in a couple of sentences what his epic story was of his service in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. So over the course of decades, I tried to tell my uncle's story, first in high school, writing a novella, and then later as a journalist, having skills of how to gather information. I started, first of all, trying to answer what happened, and once I had those answers, followed the story to Austria. Then I started trying to write a book to honor the memory of my uncle and his crew. Long story short, really compressing about 40 years of personal history. I wrote and wrote and wrote, broke away, wrote a book, broke away, came back to this story. I kept coming back to it until it was clear the publishing industry sort of had changed to the extent that they didn't see this story of my uncle's crew as remarkable enough, and this was sort of the wall that I hit in 2021. And all that time, I had kept bumping into Ben Kuroki's story, and so then ultimately, I started digging deeper. I thought, this is a fascinating story that I've had kicking around in my head for a long time, and I started drilling deeper on that. I spent a month of preliminary research, and it was so exciting, so extraordinary that I knew that this was the book that I was going to write.
So, Julie, your father wasn't going to let his story go. For those that might not have very much background or perhaps any background about who Ben has been as a person, tell us a little bit about his origin, his story up until the time that Pearl Harbor was bombed.
Right. So Ben, and I was struck, there were elements of his story that were similar to my uncle, both poor farm boys. Ben grew up in Nebraska, was one of 10 children, the middle, I believe, the sixth of 10 children. It was a hard life, born in the late 19 teens, but then the Depression hit. He was about 12 years old, and so his father, like many Japanese American stories, his father had entered this country in 1904. His mother had come a few years later as a picture bride. Father found work with Union Pacific. First in California, moving inland, then, and ended up mining coal in Wyoming. Union Pacific had a huge mine complex at Hanna. And then working on the line with Union Pacific, venturing into Nebraska and seeing this beautiful farmland along the Platte River Valley. And so Shisuke Kuroki, Ben's father, decided that that was his dream, that was his American dream, was to farm in Nebraska, which was much safer than coal mining, obviously, and was just a better place to raise a family. They had 2 children by the time they moved to Nebraska. Ben was a shy, this is a wonderful family photograph that I should say that one of the things that was a thrill for me was going through Ben's collection that he bequeathed to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, and it had his scrapbooks, photographs, correspondence, and just some wonderful artifacts of his life. And
which one is Ben in here?
so Ben is the second from the left in this photograph. 8 of the 10 children in this photograph, I believe. And if we're clicking here, there we go. This has been
Handsome guy?
Yeah, as a young man, very shy, gradually began to come out of his shell as an adolescent and teenager. Went to a very small school in Hershey, Nebraska, which is about 12 miles from the big railroad town of North Platte. And Ben graduated, high school graduating class of 10 in 1936. Now, he was vice president of that class, but it was a class of 10. And Ben was destined to spend his life on the farm, but he, I think, knew one thing fairly early, which was he did not want to spend his life on the farm. It was hard work, and so he and a buddy had pooled some money and bought a truck, and so Ben started doing long haul produce runs, taking produce from his family farm and other farms into Omaha, into other cities, and then gradually working their way to Oklahoma, all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. Came across a great article on that first run that he and his partner made into Omaha. They had a load of cabbage. And at an intersection, Ben was in the passenger seat, and the driver, they came up to a stoplight and proceeding through the intersection. Someone ran a red light. The truck driver, Ben's partner, swerved, and they turned over a load of about 1,000 cabbages in one of Omaha's most busiest intersections. So that story was spread around the state of Nebraska. So arguably that could be Ben's first claim to fame was the time that he spilled a load of cabbages in an Omaha intersection. But he was doing that, and that got him away from the farm, and then he then the clouds of war were gathering in Europe, and Ben had registered and was really waiting to be called up when Pearl Harbor happened, and then like all families, young men and young women at the time, the war changed everything.
So, to the extent that people know about the contributions of the Japanese American, the Nisei soldiers in World War II, I think we tend to think of the 100th Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and yet Ben was not part of that. I think we were talking about Art Hansen's quote that he was the 442nd before there was a 442nd. So what was it like for him to join? And I think it's interesting that this wasn't the Air Force, this is the Army Air.
Yes.
And because that was the one branch that the Japanese Americans were at first allowed to, and then not allowed to, and then allowed to again to serve in. So tell us about his experience in being part of the military at that time.
So Ben, first of all, it's important to understand the motivation that Ben would later say that Pearl Harbor, for the first time, he felt shame at his Japanese heritage, and his parents had taught him never bring shame on the family. And so he and his brother Fred, the next youngest brother, decided that they needed to enlist. They had their father's blessing. The day after Pearl Harbor, Ben went into North Platte and tried to enlist in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps recruiter turned him away. Ben heard on the radio that the Army Air Forces was taking recruits in Grand Island, which was about 150 miles away from Ben's home. The sergeant there was getting $2 a head for recruits and said, come on over. Ben and his brother Fred drove to Grand Island, and when they got there, the recruiter said, not sure if we can take a Japanese
so
American.
they're so uneven, these experiences. Yeah.
Exactly. There was this cloud in the minds of the recruiters, and official Washington didn't know what to do, and so he was turned away initially, but a couple of days later the recruiter said, come on back. And so Ben and his brother drove back to Grand Island and were accepted in the Army Air Forces and then inducted in early 1942, and that began his career in the Army Air Forces. I should note that Fred, within just a few days, again, the initial hostility, the bigotry, the prejudice they encountered was just shocking to Ben and Fred. And within a few days, it was only Ben that Fred was abruptly taken out of the Army Air Forces and put in a regular Army unit to dig ditches and dig trenches. And Ben stuck it out, but he was a clerk and in other support roles by the time they were deployed to England. And so his dream of proving his loyalty and patriotism in combat continued to be sort of out of reach even after he reached England in the fall, in September of 1942.
So the portion of your book that deals with his experiences in trying to get into the flight team, and then his record as a pilot and in the Army Air Forces just reads like a thriller. And so to tantalize the readership here, give us a little highlight of what his experiences were, the significance of the missions that he flew.
So Ben was a gunner, was an enlisted man, and so was a gunner on a 10-member crew, on a B-24 crew And when he was finally accepted in December into a combat crew in December 1942, by then the 93rd had been temporarily deployed to North Africa to support the Operation Torch Landings, the invasion of Northwest Africa. On his first mission, Ben was a waist gunner, so standing in the back third of the bomber. You stand in an open window with a 50 caliber machine gun and fire that machine gun at enemy fighters coming after you. The tail gunner was hit in the head on that first mission, and they were under fighter attack, so Ben and the other waist gunner had to remain at their stations trying to fire the weapons, and only after they had gotten out of danger could they tend to their crewmate. He survived, but the tail gunner was knocked out of action for a few months then. Back on the ground, Ben, just the weight of what he experienced, the German anti-aircraft fire, these puffs of black exploding shells, any one of these, a tiny piece could strike an engine, could strike flesh, pierce the aluminum skin of the bomber, and kill someone. So the anti-aircraft firemen just described that as terrifying. And then coming under fighter attacks, the same thing, except the fighter attacks were so fast and just there and gone. So back on the ground, Ben described just this terrible realization coming over him that he wasn't going to survive this, that he didn't think he was going to survive 10 missions. Imagine carrying that weight day after day and going up and flying missions. I want to click to, this was a wonderful photograph when Ben was still trying to get on a crew, and he had gone up on a practice flight with them, and he was so thrilled to be one step closer to combat that he had asked the crew, "We got to pose for a photograph here." And so this was wonderful.
That's a great photo.
I'm not sure why. We have a battery issue, I'm wondering. There we go, okay. So this was sort of the conditions in North Africa, very rough, very crude, living in the desert of eastern Libya in that first deployment. Ben flew 14 missions in North Africa, back to England, and flew a couple of more missions on a second mission on May 29th, 1943, on the coast of France, German submarine pens, approaching the target, 23,000 feet. All four engines quit on the bomber, and so they were plummeting toward the sea. The pilot frantically trying to get the engines restarted. They got down to 2,000 feet, just seconds from smashing into the sea. The pilot got the engines restarted and pulled out of it. There was a wonderful, I mentioned this in the book, and there was a document I found in the National Archives one day that was really captured it beautifully, was the debriefing report of the crew after this mission. The intelligence officer who was doing the debriefing noted 10 nervous wrecks, candidates for rest home. Now the rest homes were these English manor houses where they were sometimes called flak farms, of where men who were suffering from combat stress went and to decompress for a few days. One other mission I'll mention Ben flying. This was the extraordinary low-level raid on the Ploiești oil fields, Ploiești, a Romanian would pronounce it, in Romania. You can see the bombers going in at smokestack level, oil tanks exploding, a really almost a suicidal mission. And Ben could see, at that point he was flying top turret, so he had really a panoramic view of everything that was going on. Their group leader was shot out of the sky in horrific fashion, friends on either side, and this was just a devastating raid for all the survivors of the friends that they lost and the trauma that they experienced.
So this must have been taken from another airplane then.
Yes, yeah. Let me see if I have a... this is a wonderful photograph from Ben's collection of the men were so traumatized that the commanders realized that they had a serious morale problem. The men were back in the camp. They had flown this mission again from Libya, which put them within range, and so they had relocated to North Africa for a second time. They were in the Sahara outside of Benghazi. Imagine you're in this camp, bustling, thriving one day, and then half the tents are empty, the mess lines are suddenly half of what they were, and at every turn you're reminded of the comrades that were lost. And so the higher-ups knew they needed to get these men out of the camp, and so they flew them to Cairo and Alexandria. So this was Ben and some of his friends being tourists in Alexandria, Egypt, and taking a carriage ride around. There's a wonderful photo of Ben posing in a policeman's fez. And clean sheets, nice hotel, great meals, and then back to the war.
But they knew it wasn't going to last.
Exactly. 3 days and back to the war. Let me quickly jump to, so that photograph that I showed you earlier, this was Ben's 30th mission in Europe, and so that was the final close call in his Europe and North Africa tour, and on this mission was flown to Munster, Germany, number 30. Ben had flown 25. He could have gone home, but he asked to fly.
So there's a significance to the fact that he did the 25 to the 30.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
He could have gone home, but he felt, as Ben kept feeling, he hadn't done enough. He wanted to fly 5 more, in part for his brother Fred, who was not allowed to fly. So Ben flew 5 more, nearly cost him his life, and on this mission he had the turret shattered around his head, German anti-aircraft fire, nearly took his head off, ripped his oxygen mask away. When crewmates found him, he was turning blue from hypoxia. So that was the dramatic end of his European tour.
And the statistics for the survival rate were just horrifying, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
minuscule.
Yeah.
And this was the fall of 43, the worst moment you could be flying. They were flying unescorted raids, meaning they did not
No
have
cover.
fighter escorts
Yeah.
that were making sure they could fight off German fighters.
So Ben returns to the U.S. at this point, yeah?
Yes.
And now he's recognized as the first Japanese-American war hero. But his next goal is that he really wants to fly and combat against Japan. Right? So
Yes.
this is the next chapter.
So Ben, he pestered the War Department for months, and finally
And he had some clout to be able to do this, right?
Yes, he. There was that extraordinary moment. His profile was very high, and it became even higher after delivering an extraordinary speech to San Francisco's Commonwealth Club on February 4th, 1944. And so Ben made some powerful, important friends there. Among the people in attendance, Henry Kaiser, the steel tycoon who was building Liberty ships up and down the coast, and many other powerful and influential Californians. And so Ben enlisted their help. He had come a long way from the Nebraska farm boy. He was savvy. He knew he had some clout, and he knew how to use it. And so he organized a letter-writing campaign, and finally got that deployment to the Pacific. Flew 28 missions, in the Pacific as a tail gunner on a B-29 in the climactic war air campaign against Japan and the home islands of Japan.
So let's talk a little bit about that Commonwealth Club speech, because it was something that put the issue of the fact that Japanese Americans were in the detention camps, and talk a little bit about the intersection there in terms of the PR, because there was still so much pressure that kept building upon the government to keep the incarcerees detained through the rest of the war.
Right. Now, Ben's speech at the Commonwealth Club, he talked about his combat experiences. The context of when he delivered that speech is important as well, because it was just the week before that the War Department had lifted a ban on articles about Japanese atrocities against American and Filipino soldiers in the Pacific. And so the word had leaked out of the Philippines over the previous year, and so there had been a number of newspapers had written articles, but the War Department had prevented their publication, fearing that it would result in more harsh treatment of American and Filipino POWs. Suddenly the War Department lifted that ban, and the newspapers were filled with articles about the Japanese atrocities, and that unleashed this new torrent of invective and hate toward Japanese Americans, people of Japanese descent in this country. And it deeply unnerved Ben, who thought that he had proven himself, that he had flown these 30 missions in Europe, and that that had earned him a place as an American patriot. But suddenly all this vitriol frightened him. And Ben, in his speech at the Commonwealth Club, after describing his combat experiences, the camaraderie, all these men of different backgrounds, different walks of life, different ethnic backgrounds coming together in a common mission, and how he found that peace and that sort of the meaning of that more perfect union in his crew. He suddenly came back and found himself fearing to walk the streets in his own country again because of this hate that had been unleashed. So Ben, it would later be described by Ruth Kingman, one of the activists in Northern California, who was very active in trying to get the Roosevelt administration to rescind the incarceration, that Ben's speech really started a serious conversation in California about the incarceration. I know that it can be debated, the full impact of that, but Ruth Kingman, again, felt that Ben's speech was a pivotal moment in that discussion.
Of course, it would still be a couple more years before those exclusion orders would be lifted.
A full year, almost.
Yeah.
And we know Franklin Roosevelt was a political creature.
He wasn't going to do it before his election.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was up for re-election in November 1944.
Yeah.
And he wasn't going to risk the political blowback.
So I'm a Heart Mountain family. My mother and her parents were at Heart Mountain, and it was my first, I think, encounter with Ben as a war hero in the story. In my learning of what happened at the Heart Mountain camp. And so now Ben is being recognized by the Army, by the War Department, as someone that's important in their PR campaign, but they really threw him out of the frying pan into the fire by dispatching him on a 3-camp tour, if you will. So tell us about Heart Mountain. Was in particular a tricky place because of what was going on with the draft resistors. And then in your book, you have the juxtaposition of the story of Ben's journey with someone that will be very familiar to this audience, and that's Yosh Kimura.
Yes. So this is an image of the Heart Mountain Camp in Wyoming, just about a dozen miles outside of Cody. And so Ben, right after the Commonwealth Club speech, hoped that had given him the leverage to get that Pacific assignment. But the War Department sort of secretly had other ideas. The War Department had just reinitiated the draft of Nisei in January of 44 because of the brave service of the 100th Infantry Battalion in Italy, and they were losing casualties, fighting bravely, and understandably,
the numbers they needed more numbers. Yeah,
absolutely, they needed bodies for the 100th, which was the all Nisei unit. This was before the 442nd had entered combat. And so they reinstituted the draft, but the men in the camps, understandably, weren't thrilled at the idea of being behind barbed wire, being treated as prisoners of war, and then going and fighting and risking their lives for that government. So the number of recruits, as you know, was very low, and so it was going to be, they were going to force them through the draft. A draft resistance movement, as you noted, had taken root in Heart Mountain, began to spread to other camps, and so the FBI was sent in, arrests were made, and Heart Mountain was boiling when the War Department gave him orders, go to Heart Mountain. Now, Ben would say that he was not given written orders and wasn't even given detailed instructions on what to do.
And he had no idea what he was getting into. Yeah.
No idea.
Our government at work.
Exactly, that the camp was deeply divided between those who felt that you adhere to the draft, you report for your physical and start the process, and then the resistors who said no.
Well, there's lots of different flavors here, but I think the one commonality was when you restore our rights as a citizen,
right,
then we will serve.
Yes.
But until you treat us equally, we're not being treated as an American citizen, so why should we comply with the induction process?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's most of those who ultimately resisted said exactly that we will happily serve if you restore our rights and those of our family members. Yeah. And so, but Ben had no backgrounding in...
And he wasn't from California or the West Coast, right? So he didn't...
Exactly. Yeah. So Ben walks into the camps, and there's a great image, actually, that was taken... So this was actually the welcoming ceremony when Ben entered the camp in late April of 1944. You can see there's a hand-painted sign in the upper left of that photo, "Welcome Sergeant Ben Kuroki." So Ben was warmly welcomed, at least from what he saw. And he delivered speeches. Got a couple of
lots of girls in the audience there.
Yeah, and you set that photograph up perfectly. That so Ben was signing autographs, and again he was
a war hero.
A war hero,
yeah.
And so the Heart Mountain newspaper described him as a role model and what every Nisei man should aspire to be. But there was that other side, and Ben very quickly picked up on the tensions in the camp and the resistance movement, and camp administrators asked him to talk to the dissidents. And that was really tense, really unpleasant. Ben was booed, hissed. Some of the men wanted to do physical violence at Ben, directed Ben as well. I'll turn it back to this one.
So, what was his learning curve like? You know, he was a quick study in terms of picking up these nuances, but he's still got his quest to fly in the Pacific. So tell us how he's now navigating. He's becoming increasingly nuanced in his understanding of what's going on out there. So how did he actually get to what his goal was, which was to fly in the Pacific?
Right. And I want to note the camp tour, he did 2 other camps.
Yes.
And some of the same tensions in each of those camps. Ben he would later describe being shocked driving up to the gates of Heart Mountain. It was his first realization of what was happening in the camps. He had read about it, but I don't think anyone could.
I don't think for anyone, unless you see the barbed wire.
Exactly. And he saw guards wearing the uniform that he was wearing, carrying weapons, facing in. And on the other side of the fence, people who looked like him were being held like prisoners. And it was shocking, and I think the first realization of the enormity of what was happening. Ben had very set ideas that there was one response to the questioning of patriotism, and that was to serve in combat. The dissidents had a very different view, and I think that Ben had trouble comprehending and having empathy for that view. He hadn't experienced the loss of everything, of livelihoods, of homes, of freedom, of constitutional rights. So that was, I think, a process of Ben trying to wrap his head around that. And it was, I think, only later in life that he really came to see. He would describe it as, he was sort of young and full of fire and brimstone, and he viewed service as the only answer. So it was,
and that divide still exists.
Yeah. The ostracism that the men who resisted the draft and served federal prison terms and all those things. And as you know, he was interviewed late in life. Frank Abe, Frank Chin interviewed him for a film and asked him point blank and really pressed him. And Ben and his wife Shige were both interviewed, and it was. I think it was a painful moment revisiting those things because it was wading back into that very deep divide in the Japanese American community.
Yeah, I have said that there was no right answer. Everyone had to make their own decisions based on what was personal for them, what was personal for their families. We're going to come back to Frank and Art Hansen's sources. Let's talk about his service in the Pacific, and then we'll come back to that.
So he did. The camp duty was the recruiting tour was dreadful duty. Put him in an impossible situation, but he did get his Pacific tour. There was I want to jump back here to. So this was Ben being interviewed after his 28th mission. Now, his earlier missions, he flew in the first firebombing of Tokyo, and he flew in the firebombing raids. And he would later describe flying away from Tokyo on that, during the night of March 9th, 10th, and from his position in the tail, seeing this reddish orange glow for about half an hour as they were flying away. Ben, I think, like a lot of men, you couldn't go, I think, too far down the road of reflection on what your bombs were doing to people on the ground. There were moments when he reflected on that, and he was asked about that later in some of those interviews and oral histories that he did. But I think that it was, I think that flash of realization, at least momentarily, did come to him of, there are men, women, and children on the ground there where these incendiaries are being dropped. And I think that began to weigh on Ben, and he experienced severe combat stress during that spring of 1945, during his tour. And the flight surgeon in the group said, "You've done enough." Ben kept hearing that, but Ben kept saying, "No, you've done enough. Go home." He didn't want to go home, but they sent him on R&R for a few days to Hawaii. Then he came back and resumed his tour. This was his 28th mission, his final mission in the Pacific. This interview with Army Air Forces Radio aired in the United States on Sunday night, August 5th, 1945. Crossed the international date line the morning of August 6th, 1945. This aircraft had taken off during the night from the same field on Tinian Island in the Marianas that Ben was flying out of, and this was the Enola Gay landing after dropping the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima that morning of August 6th, 1945.
Was there anything in the record about his reaction to the...
No, and Ben was actually, in kind of a bizarre incident, Ben was in the hospital at the time that he had an encounter with a comrade. The men were drinking beer, and things sort of escalated, and a comrade slashed Ben across the top of the head with a bayonet. And Ben's only injuries of the war, miraculously, the only injuries, but he was in the hospital when the mission was flown, and then his crew, as quickly as they could, jumped on their B-29, got permission to fly home, and Ben was left to come home by ship.
Recovering, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of material that was assembled on Ben's life, on his service, lots of artifacts. Why wasn't there a comprehensive bio done before this point?
It's a great question. There was a quickie, a war correspondent did a book in 1946, Ralph Martin. It's a pretty thin book, and there are large gaps in the story, almost nothing on his combat service. As a journalist and as someone writing history now as well, you really scrutinize sources, primary and secondary sources, and sort of weigh the credibility. I found myself a lot with that Ralph Martin book that came out in 46, questioning, no footnotes, no endnotes. So he leaves you to believe that it was all coming from Ben, but there are such gaps and places where I just really had the sense that he was making stuff up, stuff that he didn't know, that he was filling in the gaps. I treated the book very carefully, and an incident, if it was described, it had to have a high plausibility, and I needed some sort of corroborating evidence that suggested it. Ben would later say that he didn't read it completely. The book was a big moment for Ben because, again, his profile after the war, there was a time where Ben was the most prominent Japanese-American public figure, and that book helped elevate his profile. It was reviewed by the New York Times and other publications. So, but it was a story that should have been told, and I can't fully answer
but there's
the
this
question.
gap, right?
Huge gap.
There's this gap that the Japanese American community didn't necessarily treat his profile the same way.
Yeah. You and I talked about this for a time. Ben was sharing a stage with Mike Masaoka, which I know
needs no introduction in this crowd.
And Ben was, in fact, after the war, getting platforms that Mike wasn't getting. I'll jump over to this wonderful photo of, for those of us of a certain age, will recognize this as Ed Sullivan. And Ed was a young reporter, entertainment reporter for the New York Post at the time. This was long before he became the CBS Sunday evening impresario. But Ben came back and delivered another terrific speech, this one at the New York Herald Tribune Public Affairs Forum in October of 1945. And Ben was the hottest interview in New York and was on radio shows and being interviewed nonstop.
That's a great photo.
And you're right, he sort of vanishes. Mike Masaoka, when he went to write, they called me Moses Masaoka, his autobiography. There's not a mention of Ben in the book. And so he, and after this tour, where again his profile was so high, Ben sort of receded into the mists of history for about 40 years or so.
And in your book, you call it The Long Goodbye. What happens in his post-war life, and in particular the relationship with the rest of the Japanese American community? He wasn't a part of the 442nd, but there's touch points there.
Yes. So Ben became a journalist after the war. That he had gone on this speaking tour that he called the 59th Mission, talking to civic groups, talking to school groups as well, and this very high profile. Became a journalist, owned weekly newspapers in first Nebraska, then was one of the owners of a paper in Idaho, then a paper in Michigan, started a paper as well before moving to California, and by then married, had the 3 daughters, the youngest of whom Julie is with us today, and 3 beautiful daughters. They're in the book. I have this wonderful photo that Julie shared with me of her dad with the 3 girls. And he ended up working for the Ventura County Star, I think. The newspaper's sort of, I think it's changed names a little bit, but had a wonderful career as an editor in various positions. People at the Ventura paper did not know that he had been in the war. He just didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about it to his children. Julie says that only later, when she was in college, did she get him to open up and sort of pull out that old trunk and start sharing stories. But Ben disappeared as a public persona until very late in life. And then it was this sort of remarkable series of beautiful moments of Ben being honored, starting in 2005 with Ben being presented with the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the highest Army awards, and then appearing, invited to the Bush White House for the, this is a photo from 2006 in the Prime Minister Koizumi state dinner at the White House. Julie on the left, her father, and her mother on the far right.
Very nice.
In this photograph. And then other appearances as well at the Smithsonian. And so Ben had this really beautiful final act of where he reemerged as this public figure to be honored. He also did some tough interviews, but he was gracious and made himself available to historians and some of the interviews, even though that he knew that he was may not be entirely friendly. He was going to be asked some tough questions. That he still made himself available to those historians trying to capture the record.
So I think you and I share the detective bug, the quest to keep putting all the different details together and stitching it together to reveal something that wasn't revealed before. So I would love to know if they're in the process of all of this learning that you've done and discovery that you've undergone, did anything surprise you or came about in a way that you didn't anticipate?
I would say that, and I think like you, that I love doing these books because I learn. I learn things that I should know, and things that maybe I know a little bit, but I want to learn more deeply. And for me, the most thrilling experience was learning about this rich Japanese American experience and this history that was so remarkable, and that I knew in a superficial way, and I knew about the incarceration and the camps, and I knew a little bit, or I knew at least, again, in sort of a shallow way, Ben's story. But I think that was the wonderful experience for me was I think I was a little more familiar maybe with the Chinese American experience, and then over the last 2 weeks, my wife and I were at about 3,200 miles on our 2-week driving trip.
And I hear you're still having fun.
Yeah, it's been great. So we've gotten to learn about these Japanese American communities in various parts of the country, and sort of their unique place in the fabric of this country and the history, and the farmers, the sheep herders, the coal miners, the fisher,
the abalone fishermen,
abalone divers, and all of that has just been such a revelation and a wonderful experience that. This for me, and I know for my wife as well, that will be the things that we cherish is getting to learn this piece of history that was there, but we had never fully learned. So
there's still so much that we could talk about, but we will leave the readers to dive in and enjoy this wonderful book. The title, Most Honorable Son, we should have you give a little background on how that came about to be attached to
So
Ben.
that was Ben's nickname with his crew in Europe, and his crewmates gave him. And then it became the title of Bill Kubota, a 2007 documentary film, 1 hour, lovely film. And Bill, there's a wonderful backstory to that as well, that Bill's father was in one of the camps that Ben visited. And so Bill Kubota became a journalist, became a filmmaker, and his father was sort of pestering him saying, there's this guy you got to do a film on, and so Ben had made such an impression on him during his visit to the camp, and I don't recall if it was Minidoka or Topaz in Utah, where Bill Kubota's father was, but that was how the seed was planted for Bill, and Bill used Most Honorable Son as the title of his film, and the people in sort of my publishing universe felt like that was the perfect title.
Very good. Very good. Do we have time for questions? Do we want to take? Is anybody in the audience here have anything they want to ask?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. Okay.
What happened to the guy that cut him?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
What happened to the guy that cut him?
Yeah, that's a great question.
What happened to the guy who cut him?
That I don't know. I assume he probably was busted in rank, but I don't know the end of that story. I was more. I mean, Ben. There was some concern that he might die from the. This was a carbon steel bayonet that the guy slashed him in the top of the head, and but that's a great question, and I don't think it was severe consequences, but the war was over, and I think
there were other problems.
The Army was ready to move on, so.
You mentioned something earlier about Yosh Kuromiya and the Fair Play Committee, and I wanted to follow up on it because she didn't follow up on it.
Yeah, I was very interested in finding a story, putting a human face on the resistance movement in the camps. I didn't want to just sort of deal with it in a fleeting fashion. I wanted people, readers, to really get to know someone who had been radicalized by the experience. Yosh was a Pasadena Community College art student at the time of Pearl Harbor,
Local here.
Great-looking young man. Great sort of pompadour that Elvis Presley would later make famous, and was sort of really dismissive of the idea that this backlash against Japanese Americans was going to amount to anything, and he kept saying, I don't have anything to feel guilty about. Why are you worried? And his family members were increasingly worried. And up until the time of incarceration, that Yosh just simply didn't see. He would later say, I was so naive. He didn't see this happening. And he became radicalized in camp. And I think understandably so. And so Yosh became one of the resistors who refused to report for his physical, and became part of the largest single trial of 63 young men from Heart Mountain who were put on trial in federal district court in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and convicted on draft evasion charges and served prison time. They eventually would be pardoned, but the stain of that conviction and the ostracism within the community would never go away. And so it was a heavy, heavy price that Yosh and other young men paid. But I wanted to tell his story as sort of a counterpoint, and so readers could get a feel of, the resistors and the type of people they were. I mean, they were art students and people like that they were ordinary people who were radicalized by this great injustice that had occurred. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Yeah.
We had a discussion here with the Fair Play Committee member. April 27th was another friend of his
Yes. Yeah. I got to meet last year at Heart Mountain one of Yosha's daughters, Gail, and it was a wonderful experience. And I'd already was telling a story in the book, in the manuscript at that point, and it was really a thrill to meet her. And so.
Yeah, the JANM here has had programs decently recently about the Drafter Sisters and Yosha's writings that have been published.
And beautiful watercolors as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Gregg, we could keep going, but it's been such a pleasure to learn about your process and about the journey of bringing this important story forward. And congratulations on the accomplishment, and thank you for this contribution to the bookshelf.
Thank you all for coming. I know there are any number of things you could be doing on a Saturday afternoon, so thank you very kindly. Yeah, thank you.
Well, and thanks to all of you, and thanks to JANM for this wonderful opportunity. And Gregg's going to be signing books right outside afterwards. So.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.